Well, hello everyone and welcome again to another Lean In session. I'm Michael Linke at the Australian Institute of Architects here in Melbourne, and it's fantastic to have you with me once again. Today, I meet with Roberto Bonura of Stephen Holl Architects. They're a firm based between New York and Beijing, and they work closely with government entities on the design and development of major high-profile international builds. Roberto is going to give us an overview of his background, the key issues emanating out of the US with COVID and civil unrest currently taking place, how this is impacting the architectural profession. And Roberto will also cover off his time in Beijing and talk about the rapid evolution of some of the cutting edge architecture that we're seeing coming out of China at the present time. A little bit about Roberto. He's a partner and director of Stephen Holl Architects. They're a firm headquartered in New York City, and Roberto received his degree of architecture and urban planning from the University of Chile in 1995, and then continued his studies in Chile, where he obtained a degree in urban economy in 1997. Roberto then moved from Chile and spent 10 years living and working in New York with a focus on high-profile educational, commercial and residential projects. But for the last 11 years, Roberto has lived and worked in Beijing, and he joins me now. Roberto, great to have you with us on our program today. Thanks very much for joining us. How are you?
Very well. Thank you so much, Michael. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for putting this together. It's very exciting to be in Australia again, although not in physical form. I had a lot of fun last year traveling there 3 times for the Powerhouse Museum competition. So yeah, thanks again for the invitation and for extending this space for discussion and dialogue.
Absolute pleasure. So let's start off then, Roberto, if that's okay. Let's talk a little bit about your background for those who aren't familiar with you or your work. Give us a little bit of information about your time in architecture since you left Chile.
Very good. I'll try to summarize 22 years in 2 minutes. I'll do my best. I graduated somewhat early in my life, young, 23 years old, out of a 6-year degree, master degree equivalent, out of a very full sort of curriculum, 12 semesters of design, 10 semesters of structure and urban planning and the like. I was already working since I was 20 years old, interning and doing projects on the side. Back then, nobody took a gap year. Nobody sort of stopped their career and then just said, okay, I'm going to travel. So I went straight into working. I had my own small practice. I was doing a little bit of teaching as well, architecture and structural design. And before things got very, very serious, I thought, why don't I take that gap year that everybody talks about? My first stop was New York City, and that was my last stop. I never went back to Chile. Of course, I was blown away by being in New York. I had been there as a child, but never as an adult. And I liked everything I saw. It opened my mind to everything that I saw in architecture as a life experience. Was phenomenal. And I decided to stay for a little bit. And that turned out to be 10 years. I was lucky enough to land a job at Gwafney Segal with Charles Gwafney. For your younger viewers, that's one of the 5 most influential architects in New York, alongside with Richard Meyer. And I really had a great time. I think that was my second formation as an architect. I think going through the work we did in the office, the design methodology that Charlie and Bob Segal had, the quality of the projects that we took on, the level of crafting of those projects was something nothing short of what you study in architecture, what you think architecture should be when you're studying architecture in the School of Architecture. It was great 6 years of my life. I learned lots. I progressed a lot in my career. I realized that international architecture was much larger than what I had learned in my home country. Towards the end of 2007, I realized that the most interesting things about architecture were not happening in America or in the Americas at large. China was coming up very strongly, a very promising opportunity for a young architect of my age at the time. I loved Stephen's work since I was in university. It was one of my biggest sources of influence in a way. And he was, I don't know if you see the screen, at the time, end of 2007, he was looking for someone to lead the efforts for the slice porosity block, our biggest project in Chengdu. I was thrilled to have a conversation with him about it in September 2007. And the fact that he would entrust a project like this to me at my young age, it was mid-30s at the time, it was unthinkable. So I took the opportunity, I ran with it. It was a great project. I'm going to go through some of the slides so you can see what this is about. It's the 310,000 square meters worth of mixed-use programs, all of them surrounding rather a 12,000 square meter plaza. So all the concepts of insertion of public space, increased landscape in a populated urban center, mixing different programs, cultural programs like you see here in 2 pavilions embedded into the buildings. That was a phenomenal experience and something that I enjoyed leading the team, leading the design efforts, working with the local set of consultants, and again, a project of an intellectual complexity that exceeded my toolkit at that stage. An important aspect, and this was sort of a crash course into Stephen Hoare Architect's principles of architecture. One of them is the infusion of these other programs, cultural programs. What you see here is a series of bridges and pavilions that inject cultural facilities into this large mixed-use program. So that was an excellent learning experience for me. Working together with Livius Woods in his only piece of architecture ever accomplished in this light pavilion was another personal enriched experience of mine. After that, of course, what originally intended to be 2 years of staying in China became 12. Well, we're running out on 12 now. Projects became more interesting. My responsibilities in the office escalated to the director, now partner. And it's been easy to get spoiled with the work we do. And again, I think of it this way. If I ever set out to work in an environment that most resembled the principles that you learn in university, what you really study for, I think I am at the right place. And it's been an amazing 12 years in everything that we have done. So I try to summarize as much as I could.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Roberto. Let's talk about Beijing and New York together. I mean, how much do you engage with your studio in New York City? And I suppose we're in the midst of, as everybody knows, the COVID-19 epidemic. How have the 2 studios, both in Beijing, the epicenter really in terms of a country for the coronavirus, how have the 2 studios reacted to COVID-19 in terms of shutting down, in terms of pulling back from work? What are the main differences between the Beijing office and the New York office in terms of the reaction to this global pandemic?
Right. As I was thinking about this question yesterday before the interview today, I realized that we talk about our offices, 2 offices, 1 office in 2 different places, and the way that they complement each other. I see now that after going through the experience of what we had gone through here in Beijing, we sort of wrote the script to what New York will do a few months later in an amazing way. For us, of course, we were hit by it earlier, very quickly. We became aware of the situation. I remember very clearly in January 23rd, it was a Friday, I think. And in a week's time, Michael, everything has changed. Everything had changed. The city, the entire country was in lockdown. Supermarkets were locked down. This also coincided with the Spring Festival. I don't know if you know, Asian countries, China in particular, they celebrate a different set of calendar, the lunar calendar. And Spring Festival, that normally happens at the end of January, beginning of February, was happening right at that moment. It's a confusing time for a Western company because you come out of Christmas. You try to go back to business. You survive the end of the Western year, and then you had these holidays that are never necessarily relaxing. So we were back in China, trying to do work. Spring Festival hits, the COVID pandemic hits. Nobody can come back to Beijing. Everybody's traveling throughout China. It's the one holiday of the year that most people travel. So within a week, we didn't have an office. We didn't know what our projects will look like, if they will continue. The urban environment was in complete lockdown. So with our managing associate and myself, we came up with a very strong, very quick response to what are we going to do. First instance was try to bring it back, everybody who could come back safely to Beijing, because we knew about SARS before, although I had not been here, but we know a lot about SARS, and we know what happened in the aftermath of SARS and how long it took for the country to come back on its feet. So we try to bring back as many people as possible to Beijing. 3 of our 10 people staff couldn't. So they're still working from Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. We consider not to be safe for them to come back, so we have worked with them from remote. Mid-February, things started to pick up a little bit. Finally, we had some feedback from our clients. They were coming back from Spring Festival. They were very, very much interested in continuing our work. So our first line of priority at that moment was to structure the office to work from remote. But in that, I think we're very seasoned. Our Beijing office has been working from remote in some capacity for a good part of 12 years. I mean, China is a large country. We work with consultants all over China. We work very closely with New York, obviously. And we work with consultants all over the world, mostly Europe and the US. So it didn't really change as much for us in Beijing, having to work from remote. It was more about creating the environment for people to be enthusiastic, engaged in the work, me sort of controlling what everybody was doing from remote, which was a bit of a challenge. But I want to think that everything went seamlessly until the beginning of March, when we resumed work here in the office. With New York, it has been a different story. I think for first, the reason that the pandemic has, or the quarantine, the lockdown has stretched far longer than China had to endure. Second, I think Steven particularly loves to work with physical models. We all do, but I think we are more used to the digital tools available. And now we're doing 2 competitions, and it's been a bit of a challenge to work with limited physical model resources. But by and large, New York office actually became very adapted. We wrote the script, as I told you, all in the safety measures that we had gone through and planned out were the script for New York to take over. Interestingly, for the last 10 years, in a very conscious way, our office has become more of a collaborative approach to design and architecture. That's been something that Steven and the 3 partners have been pushing the office to go into. And now with this pandemic and the way that we have to do work digitally, connect through Zoom, it has become the most collaborative version of our office, I think. Every Friday we have happy hours at 5 p.m. in New York time, 5 a.m. here on Saturday, which is a bit of a struggle. And we invite other people to join us in Zoom and critique our projects and go through the design process with the voice of everybody. We're talking about 40, 50, sometimes 60 people joining these Zoom meetings, reviewing our work, which is phenomenal. It's been the silver lining of this very difficult situation.
You talk about Chile. I mean, that's where you studied. You talk about working in New York. You're now in Beijing. I mean, you've had a very international career, Roberto. Tell us, and you did touch on this earlier in relation to China sort of being the textbook architectural career. How does the practice of architecture differ from, say, the US to China, or from country to country? What's your experience?
That's a great question. And I think the longer you are in this business, the easier it gets, obviously. But as you may imagine, there's so much associated to architecture that seems to be idiosyncratic. And by that, I mean codes, obviously, that's the first thing that comes to mind, construction methods, budget, cultural sensibilities, right? History of a place, history of a country, of a city, way of collaborating with people, always. I mean, we do, I would say, at any given time, 75 to 90% of our work through collaboration. So how you engage every discipline in every country, every client in every country is immensely different. However, all the problems of one project are the problems of all projects. You always have to face budget issues. You always have to face code compliance and permitting. You always have to face how people interpret your work and the relationships you form with a client. It's been very important for us and that's where I spend most of my efforts, to be honest, to do 2 things. The first one is to find good opportunities where a good project of architecture has all the ingredients to succeed. And that means a client with a vision, and obviously a good site, a good program, and an interesting subject to work with. And the second thing that I can't stress this enough is good collaborators. And I think we just came out of this great experience with Conrad Gargett out of Sydney, with Dale Swan, Lawrence Toaldo, Laura Cockburn and their whole team in Sydney office during the Powerhouse competition. And Lawrence and I started talking about this competition 1 year before the RFQ submission. That's how far in advance I have to look at these things. And through dialogue, talk, countless conversations and exchanges, we arrived at the conclusion that, yeah, we could partner with them, they could partner with us. We're very different firms, but we align on the principles. And I think that became the textbook example of how we do collaboration, just really looking for good partners that you can trust, and which exchanges become beyond just the typical work of architecture. It just becomes a shared vision for the project. And that's how we survive, and that's how we thrive through international collaborations.
Right. While we've got your screen up, Roberto, tell us a little bit more about maybe some of the projects you're working on in Beijing at this stage.
Very good. Let me just go very quickly through some of them. We're doing this little building in Beijing. It's an office, sort of mixed-use project, 16,000 square meters. It's going through another permitting process, so we're pretty enthusiastic about it. Hopefully we'll start construction soon. So you can see, very interesting geometry, not the easiest project to do. So intellectual challenges continue to amount. Beautiful interior spaces, the idea of co-working, but now we will have to rethink, by the way, co-working will change if it survives. So I think we will have to go through a round of redesign for this project in the way that we had faced or thought of the working environment may not be so after the COVID pandemic is over. Another project that we're very enthusiastic and very grateful to have a great client actually out of Shenzhen is our iCarbonX headquarters. It's a 140,000 square meters headquarters building for iCarbonX, a leading company in genomics. One tower will host their offices and the other tower will host the residences for the researchers. Again, with ideas that we try to include in each one of our projects, the inclusion of landscape, public space, public functions is a very important element in this project. I was telling you before, in mid-February, we started getting calls from our clients. No, we're back to business, we want to do this. The go-to attitude that our clients have, that I think China has at large, you can do things. It was very invigorating for us to know that the site was being reopened again in March, and then work has not stopped since then. It's a monster of a project, as you can imagine. So we're very enthusiastic about this. Very happy with another project in Shanghai. It's a smaller sort of building, about 10,000 square meters, between a cultural center and a health center. Now at a great moment in the history of this project, in the sense that the shells are up, the concrete is up. It's creating already this public space in between the two. Very inspiring to see these images. I haven't been able to go back to the site, unfortunately, because of travel restrictions. But I look forward to go back there soon and enjoy what I've seen in pictures so far, which is quite an enthusiastic moment for the project. So this will hopefully be done by the end of the year. We will have another interesting architectural intervention by the end of the year. Another big project, we're doing 54,000 square meters of religious and cultural buildings in Taiwan. For a private client. This is a religious building, which we call the Oceanic Pavilion, that explores these casting place concrete shells overlooking the ocean on a sheath of water underneath an array of cultural facilities and prayer rooms and the like. This is in the middle of a beautiful site, a cemetery, a very popular one. And it's a building that is sort of sliding off the mountain and embedded into the mountain. It's a huge site, as you can see. It's also under construction. I've gone to this, we've been working on this project for a good part of 5 years. So it's very happy now that the geometries of these domes that I was describing earlier are starting to materialize. And it's very exciting to walk through a building in the making. And I think the last one that I want to share with you, no, I think that's it. Those are the ones. Another one that I cannot share with you is a competition we're doing in Shenzhen. It's a monster of a building. It's 220,000 square meters of opera house, operetta, concert hall, and multifunction. A competition we're doing against Jan Nouvel, Calatrava, Herzog and de Moran, Esnojeta, and a total of 20 firms. And at some point, I have to tell you why we thought that was a good idea, but we love the design. I cannot show you anything. Hopefully, I'll be able to show you a little bit of that in a few months from now. It's a very exciting project. And something, going back to the collaboration between the two offices and working from remote in the COVID era, I had to write this down. For this project, we are working out of 13 different locations. We have Nagata, our acoustics engineers from Los Angeles. We have our theater consultants from Canada and North Carolina and the US. We have Transolar and Sustainability working out of Stuttgart. We have Arup for mechanical systems out of New York and Beijing. Our own office is working out of 6 locations. We have Shenzhen, we have Hong Kong, we have Taiwan, Beijing, we have New York 5 bureaus, we have New York Upstate, we have New Jersey. And we have, about 13 locations working on one project. This is the new way of doing architecture. It is, for sure.
Some beautiful projects there. They really are quite lovely. The work that you do in Beijing, I mean, you've been there for 11, almost 12 years, like you say. What are some of the benefits or advantages that you have by running a studio in Beijing that you may not get in other places? You've worked in the US. I mean, I suppose in other words, what makes you love the city where you've been for this period of time?
Yeah, we're very grateful about being here. Spending 12 years of your life, a small fraction of it was not a small portion. It's been great for us to have the number of opportunities that we've had. The mentality of things, of setting up missions and how to line up to do that. It's something that you see in China and nowhere else. So in terms of resources, I think the first one would be the amount of interesting opportunities that we've been able to encounter here, for sure. Usually running an office here is not created when you're a small footprint of an office. We're never more than 40 people. We believe in quality more than quantity work, and we try to keep our group of collaborators.
Perfect. Apologies for those who are watching, and sometimes it's sadly the internet connectivity in Beijing, where Roberto is coming to us from live, is it can be somewhat patchy, so apologies, but we're getting the gist of what you're saying. It's just been perfect up until now, Roberto, please don't stress. Yeah, we were just talking, as you remember, Roberto, just in relation to the challenges that you face in Beijing, and you were just going through a number of the different challenges that working in China presents.
All right. I was concluding with the thought that finding good collaborators and finding good opportunities is key, and that's what I spend most of my time doing. Mostly generating human relationships. The business of architecture in China, like any other business here, is a business of trust. It's a business of face-to-face contact and engagement way before any project actually happens. So I wouldn't call that a challenge. I would call it something that we're mindful of and that we continue to work on every day.
I want to talk about office dynamics. Now, as you well know, the structure of organizations and reporting lines in China is vastly different to here in Australia or America, or where many of our architect members practice. What are some of the biggest cultural differences in an office setting in China v. any other Western country, and how did you successfully adapt to those different cultures?
And that's a great question. Everything in China is larger by definition. Our collaborators are normally very large companies, thousands of people. And so are our clients as well. The project that I showed you at the beginning, for Capital Land, is a huge multinational corporation. We, in contrast, we're a small boutique firm in a way, but we have a very horizontal structure compared to our collaborators that seem to be more hierarchical. That's something that I particularly have learned how to deal with, in the fact that you try to find one individual within the organization that best represents that organization, with whom you share that vision for the project, and with whom you can actually team up and collaborate better. Otherwise, you pretty much get lost in in the corporate structure of the local architect or the structural engineering firm or the client. So if you're able to find early on in the design process that one collaborator that shares your vision that you can communicate with, that allows you to make decisions in a more informed and fair way, that's the key to navigate these two differences. You know, us being boutique and horizontal against or in contrast with these large corporations that we love to work with.
In terms of design, Roberto, as we see it reported in our media, we know that the Chinese government can operate in a vastly controlling manner. However, what you've just shown us is incredible and impressive and risk-taking design projects, both in the public and the private realm. How does the Chinese government engage with build and design to allow such a contrast?
I can imagine how that's the way people can see it from the West. I would see it that way as well if I just read what is published of architecture. China is a very diverse country. It's large. And it's a bad example, but just to give you an idea, the US has 50 states. Every state has its own way of doing things in some regard. Some of them are more progressive, some of them are more conservative. So the same thing applies to China to some degree, a very superficial comparison here. There are areas like where Kat, we were just discussing before the call, she used to live in Shenzhen. Shenzhen is one of the most progressive areas in terms of architectural design. Right now, I was having dinner before COVID with the authorities there. They were telling me there will be 40 new competitions or something like that in the next 2 years, and they have delivered on it. And the competition that we're doing now for the Shenzhen Opera House is probably the most important one of a great effort to bring in international and local contemporary architecture. So there is Shenzhen, there is Shanghai. You would say maybe south of China is a bit more progressive in that sense, whereas northern parts of China, especially Beijing, tend to be a bit more conservative. And it has to do with, historically, Shenzhen, Shanghai, the south, the free economic zones were set up in a way that were more risk-taking areas in that regard. So I think most of the architecture that you find interesting, following your wording in the question, comes from those areas that are the south of China. Not to say that we cannot do that in the north, obviously. I mean, we're doing it. It's just, it's at a different pace.
In 2002, Zaha Hadid Architects won the Guangzhou Opera House competition with its unique twin boulder design. You may recall that. It was one of the first modern architecture projects to be commissioned in China. And remarkably, the design was chosen by the public. And since then, China has really been on the forefront of some incredible, real cutting-edge design. So how do locals, Chinese citizens react and interact to these types of projects? And what benefits have been brought to the local communities?
Oh, great question. I participate every year on a number of roundtable discussions. So I love to have contact with universities, and there's been an ongoing healthy dialogue about this same subject. And I think every aspect of the discussion is properly represented. On the one side, you have people who think very strongly that contemporary architecture should reflect principles of the local culture, which we try to observe as best as we can, and I know most of the successful international companies here do as much. And then you have the other side of things that people feel very strongly that they want, they value contemporary architecture in the sense that it's being produced at a very high level, very high quality level now, by many firms in China. So they welcome these new influences and they welcome this dialogue. So everything is sort of in between. I think there are buildings that are really well received, like, as you mentioned, Zaha Hadid's Opera House, which, by the way, is in the south of China. The areas that I tell you are more open for risk-taking when it comes to architecture. And there are the buildings that have not fared so well, and people have been somewhat critical about them. We're very mindful about that, obviously. We're very mindful about that. In the end, the benefit that this brings to the people. As I mentioned before, Shenzhen is planning 40, or plus minus 40 cultural buildings in that city. Public investment, a huge public investment. There is a concerted effort to provide these buildings as part of the public realm in Shanghai, in Shenzhen, in areas that we have participated doing cultural facilities or cultural building designs. And that alone, I think in my view, we can't have enough of those. We can't have enough of public areas, public spaces, landscape areas in these huge, densely populated cities. You can't have enough of cultural facilities that democratize the function of culture, democratize the use of landscape areas in these large cities. So from the way I see it, our project in Chengdu, for instance, the 12,000 square meters plaza, it was a great success. People really loved it. If you have been to Chengdu, or some of your viewers have been to Chengdu, they may agree with me in saying that it's a place where people really take ownership of the public areas. Maybe it is the weather, maybe it is the local culture, whatever it is. People really enjoyed that public space, and phenomenal event to have been able to provide that for the city. So yes, in terms of the public's interaction with public facilities, it's definitely a plus.
Let's talk about physical distancing then. I mean, that's a challenge for everybody in every urban area here in Australia and especially in the US, and not to mention a densely populated country like China. I mean, how do you think this pandemic will impact the way cities and buildings are designed? And do you think it will have an impact on how the public experience architecture?
I have split feelings about this question because, you know, I see everything that is going on in the States, and I see people refusing to observe social distancing as a freak point of information. Las Vegas opened a couple of days ago, so I see the will of many people to just try to go back to business as usual. On the other hand, I think I'm living the future right now in China. As I told you at the beginning, within a matter of 1 week, things changed in Beijing. There was the second wave of e-commerce, for instance, the first wave out of SARS. Now, within a week, the entire commerce industry had shifted gears to provide everything through the phone, through WeChat, which is the version of a similar version to WhatsApp that we normally use in the West. Social distancing, crowd controlling, centralization of points of access. There was an immediate operational shift in buildings, private buildings, obviously offices, residential buildings, but also in large-scale areas when we could go back out in the street. So I see those operational shifts to remain. I don't see that will go away anywhere. There was now more people using public areas like parks with limited control. You would have to register in advance to get tickets because we're controlling the crowds within the public areas. I see that also maybe something that will remain to some degree, some level of interpretation. I see also in the future, there's a lot of discussion that I've read about, and I find it reasonable. Materiality shift as well. You know, we will maybe not start using porous materials anymore, antibacterial materiality and filtering for HVAC systems. I see those small little changes in our profession, like in the same way that SARS influenced natural air and cross-air ventilation regulations in Asia at the time. I would expect some sort of legal structure to follow up with that. I'm going back to your question in terms of the urban environment. I would be afraid of two things. And everything that I've been reading about is making me scared a little bit. The first one is that there might be a case that people pursue for lower density. And that's all good until it becomes a problem by enlarging the city. Urban sprawl has been something that obviously, I think most people will agree, has devastated natural resources. It's something that our firm has obviously stayed away from. We have worked on projects in urban settings like the Chengdu project that I showed you that seek to respond to an issue of density while providing public spaces, public functions, cultural functions, increased greenery and sustainability design. So I hope that we as a profession or the real estate market at large resists the knee-jerk reaction to become less dense and start expanding the cities. and instead that we work on how to improve the conditions of a city. The city, after all, is probably one of the most sustainable ways of living in society. We're maximizing the use of infrastructure. We're sharing the cost of that. We're not using land that otherwise will belong to agricultural or other functions. Cities are critical elements where, by association, by social interaction, there's ingenuity, there are new things, inventions coming up. There's the agglomeration effect that help, obviously, economies propel and become more robust. So I think there's still many good things about keeping the city as it is. Improve the use of public spaces. I use the word democratizing public spaces. I read somewhere a report that Foster and Partners wrote, which I thought was pretty interesting, that less than 30% of the green areas in London are for public functions, public use. 36 or 40% of them are private. So I hope that we're going in that direction, that instead of going away from the city, that we invigorate the city with more democratic use of public space. France now is opening 650 kilometers worth of bike lanes. New York, 65. Milan is making 40 kilometers of pedestrian streets. I hope that that's the way we're going in terms of urban development. And the second thing that worries me is that we may miss this opportunity, which has been devastating for so many people. We may miss the opportunity to create a shift in the way we live, in our lifestyle. Now, considering public spaces as part of our domain now, respecting it, taking care of it. As designers, emphasizing light, air, ventilation, integration of public functions, like I was saying before, to invigorate the lifestyle of people living there. Living in a city normally and living in New York for 10 years, you think of your apartment as the place you're going to spend the night. Now it is the space where you have to work, where you will probably, as we're doing, homeschooling our child. So when we design developments that are residential in nature, think that the same place that you're living is not so much a temporary place that you will use when you're not visiting museums, when you're not visiting the park, when you're not going to the theater, because there may be opportunities that they may not happen for a long stretch of time. So it must be a place that is comfortable, that we design with provisions that allow people to work and study and invigorate the social connections between the family, more than just being a temporary place of occupancy for the hours of the night.
Roberto, what we'll do is we may leave it here if that's okay. We're having increasing issues in terms of being able to hear you, and I apologise to everybody and yourself, Roberto. I mean, it's a challenge, but this is the joy of live broadcasting, I will say. So I do want to say a massive thank you to you, Roberto. We may get you on again at another stage if that's okay, because I would like to revisit some of the key sort of facets you were talking about in relation to development in China. I did want to ask you some questions in relation to your advice for some of our younger architect members who are very keen to go across, to different countries and practice internationally to get some of that experience. And I feel that you've got a lot to offer in that space. So with your permission, I'd love to bring you back in at a future event, if that's okay, where we can finish off some of this stuff. How does that sound? Great. Okay, so that's it from you, Roberto. I do want to say a massive thank you to Roberto Benura of Stephen Hall Architects. Thank you very much for joining us, and it's been great to have him.